Hey there, welcome to the channel. So I think you know what these things are. They're gluten-free toaster pastries, also known as Pop Tarts. So I think we should try to make this homemade gluten-free version and see how they come out. I'm Jamie with SavorySaver. I share gluten-free recipes, tips, tricks, and resources to make your gluten-free lifestyle easier. So please consider hitting subscribe and let's make some gluten-free Pop Tarts. So the gluten-free Pop Tarts or toaster pastries recipe that I'm making today comes out of the Gluten-Free and More magazine that we get here. Tara was getting it for a while and then she decided she didn't want it, and now she just recently subscribed to it again. I will link down below if you want more information on that. It's about $30 a year, I think. You can get it through Amazon as well. So I'll link down below to Amazon as well as directly to their website. The recipe is from another blogger, so I will try to find the actual printed recipe to link you directly to that as well. And I'll go over any changes that I'm making as we do the recipe. And the first change is this shows a blueberry filling. I'm actually gonna make a strawberry filling. So the recipe is gonna be the same, except I'm gonna make one little swap and one little change. We're gonna start our filling first because we want it cold by the time we put it in our pastries. So let's get that started. So again, the original filling in the recipe shown is 1.5 cups of frozen blueberries and the ingredients to make the filling. If you wanna be super lazy with this, or maybe you don't wanna make filling because you don't wanna use the fresh fruit, use some jam. You're basically got the same thing there. So if you got a jar of strawberry jam or your favorite other fruit jam, try that instead of this. I'm gonna make strawberry. So I do have frozen whole strawberries. There's 3 cups in the bag. We need 1.5 cups. So I'm going to cut up about half of them. I did get whole berries. They are still mostly frozen. The recipe doesn't say if I have to cut them up or not. So I'm going to slice them. They will slice better if they are still partially frozen. So I'm gonna slice up those and get them in here. You're not looking for perfection, just slice them up so they're smaller. So once the strawberries are sliced up, and again, they're all different sizes, it's gonna cook down, so don't worry about being too perfect on your slices, but they do slice better when they're partially frozen. So to that, I'm gonna add 1 tablespoon of lemon juice and 3 tablespoons of water. And I didn't have any lemon juice, so I've got the bottled concentrated stuff that I'm not a super fan of, but that's what I had. So I didn't have lemon, so I just swapped it out for a little bit of lime juice and the water, so that goes in there. I wanna add 1 tablespoon of a gluten-free flour blend with the xanthan gum. So I'm gonna add that. That of course is gonna thicken it. And since it's 1 tablespoon, you could probably use cornstarch or arrowroot, something along those lines. You could probably use that as opposed to this. Maybe a little less cornstarch than the tablespoon. We're also gonna add a little bit of sugar. I'm gonna add 3 tablespoons. If you don't like it as sweet, cut that back a little bit. The recipe calls for a 1/4 teaspoon of cinnamon, and since I'm using strawberries, I don't want cinnamon in my strawberries. So I'm not gonna do that. Once everything's in here, I'm gonna put it on the stove over medium heat. I'm gonna stir it. It says to stir constantly. We're not gonna stir it constantly. Just check it every minute or so. Make sure it's not sticking to the bottom of your pot. You wanna cook it over medium heat for about 15 to 20 minutes until it's thickened, and then we'll pop it in the fridge to cool off while we make our pastry. So I'm gonna move you guys over to the stove. We'll do a few shots with what that should look like, and then we're gonna move on to the pastry. So everything in here is blended well, and I'm starting to get just a little bit of steam because my berries weren't totally thawed, so they needed to, come up to temperature along with the liquids. So I set a timer for 20 minutes just to keep me on track where this should be about finished in that time. So just go in every couple minutes, give it a stir, make sure you're scraping the bottom so that nothing's sticking. I am using non-stick hard anodized aluminum. So if you're using stainless steel or another type of cookware, just be aware that you may get some of the sugar wanting to caramelize on the bottom. So just adjust your heat down if you need to, and make sure you're continually checking it to keep some of that from happening. You're basically making an easy, quick jam, which is why your favorite jam would work in this recipe as well. So we are getting some bubbling now. So I'm going to just keep an eye on it, keep stirring it. I think I'm going to bump my heat down from medium, even though the recipe says to cook it on medium. I'm going to bump it down just a little to maybe medium low. And you want those strawberries to break down some more into a jam. You could mash them if you want. That would be fine. But I'm just going to keep cooking it and let them break down on their own some. And I'll show you what it looks like when it's done. So we are about 15 minutes into the cooking time. I've got my heat down at medium low, which is where I've had it since I cut it back. And I think that's thick enough for me. The strawberries have broken down, so there's still some pieces, but there's a lot of good jammy consistency. I'm gonna take this off the stove. I'm gonna move it to a bowl and I'm gonna let it chill in the fridge while I make my pastry. So I've got a metal bowl, it was easy to grab, and I put it in the fridge to chill down a little bit so it'll chill this a little faster. This is still loose, but it's gonna firm up a little bit more as it cools. So remember that. So let's turn off our heat. We'll cut off our timer. So I did mine for about 15 minutes. I'm gonna transfer it to my bowl and get it in the fridge, which I don't think you need to watch. So let's move over and make our pastry. So let's start making our pastry, and I'm going rogue here already. The original recipe has you mix the wet ingredients and then add the dry ingredients to it, and then mix the dry ingredients before incorporating it into the wet ingredients. I didn't really like that, basically because I'm trying to show you guys how to do it. So I'm gonna take a small bowl. I'm gonna add 1 cup of gluten-free measure for measure flour with xanthan gum. This is Bob's Red Milk, so I will link down below if you're having trouble finding it. To that, I'm gonna add an additional ½ teaspoon of xanthan gum, and this already has it in it, so evidently we need a little more for structure, would be my guess. So we're gonna add that to it. Next, I wanna add 1 teaspoon of baking powder, and make sure your baking powder is gluten-free if needed. I don't usually see it with gluten, but this one is clearly marked gluten-free on the back. We're also gonna add a ½ teaspoon of salt. I'm gonna whisk it all together in here just to incorporate everything. So now that we've got our dry ingredients ready, let's get our wet ingredients together. I've got 1 egg that I've cracked into the bowl, and it's decided it was already gonna continue scrambling itself up. I'm also gonna add a 1/4 cup of regular granulated sugar. To that, the recipe says you can add one of 3 things. You can either use melted coconut oil, you can use unsalted butter, or vegan buttery sticks. I am using melted butter, so I'm gonna add that to it. It is unsalted. Now it says to whisk it all together. Everything looks pretty mixed together. I don't see any sugar in there, although I'm sure all of it is not quite dissolved, but everything's the same color. It's pretty thick because of the egg. So we're gonna call that good. I'm gonna add my dry ingredients. And it says to either switch to a rubber spatula or your hands until it makes a soft dough. And if that doesn't happen, I have a couple teaspoons of plain water, and I'm just gonna add a teaspoon at a time until it comes together. So I'm going to start with my spatula, and I may switch over to my hands depending on how it mixes. So guys, I've made it into a ball. It didn't take my hands, and it suggests using the water if the dough is crumbly. I'm not getting any of that. So what I'm gonna do, because it says to roll them out, and there's no way this dough is rolling from what I can tell. So I'm gonna let it sit for 3 to 5 minutes. I wanna see if the liquids absorb into the gluten-free flour and if the xanthan gum, starts doing its job. So I'm gonna let it sit for a few minutes. If it doesn't get much stiffer than this, then I may add a little bit more flour. So I'm gonna jump you guys ahead after this rests for 3 to 5 minutes. So it's been well over 5 minutes because I actually let it sit for probably 20 minutes or so because I get to doing some other stuff. So I feel like it's much better now as far as a soft ball. So definitely let your dough rest for this recipe for a few minutes so everything can absorb into it. Now we need to roll it out, which is probably going to be my most unfavorite part of this recipe. I'm not a big, happy camper when I have to roll stuff out, but we got to do it to get some of these gluten-free recipes that we want to try to make, don't we? So I've got my mat. It says you can roll it between 2 pieces of parchment paper, and I don't want to have to spend a lot of money on parchment paper all the time. So I'm going to try it with my mat, and I'm going to be baking on parchment paper. So I'm going to put this over the top of it, and I'm hoping I can roll everything out and still bake it on this parchment paper. So I do have a piece of parchment paper off to the side if I need the extra piece. I've also turned on my oven to 375 degrees so it can preheat while I get these made. So we're aiming to make 6 of them out of this dough. So we're gonna need to make 12 rectangles about 3 by 4 inches. And the dough is gonna need to be super thin. The recipe actually says it should be slightly see-through, but thick enough to handle without ripping. So let's see how difficult I can make this happen. We're hoping for the best, and we'll see what it does. All right, I've got my dough patted out. I'm gonna roll it out super thin, and then we will cut it. Okay, so it looks like it's about 1/8 of an inch thick. We're gonna see how that goes. Now it needs to be cut, and then any scraps we can put all back together and roll again. So I'm trying to get 6 toaster pastries. So I'm gonna get the pizza cutter, I think. And I can't find my ruler as usual, so I've got the measuring tape. I'm gonna try to do some 3 by 4 rectangles, and we'll see what happens. So I've squared it up. This is about 12 inches, so I'm gonna mark 4, 8, 12. And do it to the other side as well. 4, 8, and then 12 at the bottom. All right, so I've got my first ones cut out. And while I was doing that, the oven is ready. And of course, they're not perfectly square, but that's fine. So now I'm gonna try to get them up and onto the cookie sheet. And then what we'll do is we'll re-roll, and I'll get another 6, and then we'll finish them off. Okay, so here are my first 6. As you can see, they are by no means perfect. They're stretched out because I moved them. They're not totally square anymore, but I think they're usable. So I've got one here that is about the same size as the rest. I think I'm gonna use it if I can. And all this is the scrap. I'm gonna re-roll that, of course, to get the other parts. And I think what's gonna make it easier for me is I'm going to try to leave the bigger piece of each one rolled on the bottom and the smaller piece on top, because I'm hoping I can either stretch it out just a little bit, or I can take the bigger piece and fold it over to keep everything closed, because we're gonna take a fork and go around the edges. So let me work on this, get what I need, and then we'll fill them, crimp them, and bake them off. So let's start by adding our filling. It is chilled, so it's thickened up a little bit, and we're gonna put about a tablespoon of filling in each Pop-Tart. I'm gonna seal this one back together with my fingers. Push the dough in if you need to. It says you want the dough thin enough so it doesn't tear, but there's no gluten in here, so I think that's part of the issue, of course. So let's do a tablespoon of filling, and then we'll go back and spread it out some. So I've got approximately a tablespoon of filling in each one. I do have leftover, but I've tasted this. It's really good. It's not overly sweet. So that gluten-free bread that you're toasting, go ahead and use this jam up on that. So I've got that off to the side. We need to make sure there is a little bit of border around the edges. The directions don't say how much. So I'm gonna probably try to do a 1/4 inch or so at least to give the other dough some room to seal. But first, I'm gonna clean it up a little bit. So I'm gonna wet my fingertips and just try to get the jam spread across the dough, because it's really close on the edge over here, and this is kind of haphazard. So I'm gonna try to square it up just a little bit with some wet fingertips. All right, let's get the tops on and see how well that works for me, and just try to match up your other 6 with the size of these. So it's not gonna be exact, but we're hoping we're gonna clean that up when we take the fork and get everything pressed in together. So far, I mean, if you like baking and making your own stuff, this is a pretty good recipe so far. So let's get everything sealed. I do have some tears in the dough, so I'm gonna see what we need to do about that. I may actually leave them as steam vents as opposed to punching holes in the top with my fork. So I'm gonna go around the edges and seal everything in. So the best thing to do is take your fork. I've got my finger right on the bottom of the fork there. You want to press and pull, because if you lift up, it's going to want to lift that dough up, and we don't want that. So you want to press it down to seal the two, and then pull your fork back. And that will keep it sealed without lifting the dough up. Okay, so everything's been crimped. I've got a little bit of the strawberry jam trying to come out on this one, and then some of them actually are larger on the bottom. So what I'm gonna try to do now, just to further keep everything in, is I think I'm gonna try to square everything up a little bit, and hopefully that will keep everything from bubbling out too much. I think we're still gonna get a little bit of seepage, but let's try to minimize that. Okay, I think I'm pretty happy with these. We have to do 2 little short steps before we can bake them off. One, we need to give it some place for the steam to go. So I'm gonna take my fork and puncture each one twice. And then there's a couple here that, this one already has some vents over it because it tore. So I think I'm only gonna give it 1 in the middle. This one will do 2, even though there's a little bit of tearing, it looks like. And this one will do 2. Final thing we need to do is give it an egg wash. I've got 1 large egg. I'm just gonna whisk it up. Now that it's been whisked up, we wanna brush each one with some of the egg wash. Gonna give it a little bit more color. It's also gonna help seal everything in. Okay, everything has been coated with egg. Now we need to bake them. They are gonna bake for 20 minutes until they're golden. Then we're gonna let them cool for about 10 minutes and we will ice them. So while these bake, I will make the glaze. And I don't like glaze and Tara does like glaze. So I'm only gonna make half of the recipe of glaze. So let's get these in the oven and get the glaze made. So to make our glaze, again, this is half a recipe. I've got a 1/4 cup of powdered sugar and 1 tablespoon of milk. You could also use dairy-free milk or water. So I'm gonna add that in there. I'm gonna mix it all up. Okay, right now it looks a little thin to me. I may add a little more powdered sugar to thicken it up some because I want it to actually set and not run all over the place. So I may add a little more powdered sugar to it before we top them. But for now, our gluten-free Pop Tarts are baking. So I'm gonna let them finish baking. I'm gonna let them cool, and then we can worry about putting on our topping. So the gluten-free Pop Tarts have been cooling for about 10 minutes, and I did add a little more powdered sugar to the glaze, maybe 2 teaspoons to another tablespoon. It has thickened it up some, and the time has allowed the powdered sugar to dissolve more. So I don't know if it's gonna firm up even once it's on there, but hopefully it will. So I'm gonna lift one up so you guys can see it, and we'll see if they're gonna break on me. They actually feel pretty sturdy. So there's what one looks like. There's what it looks like underneath. It's nice and golden. Smells really good. I think I'm gonna top 3 of them, and I'm gonna top the ones that have the most cracks on them. For 1, to cover it up, and for 2, maybe it'll seal that filling in even more. We did not have anything spilling out the sides, which I really like. So far, I have to say, as far as making these, great recipe to make. You know, it's all about the taste in the end, but as far as making these as a Pop-Tart substitute because you can't buy them, really good idea. Okay, so let's top these. I'm gonna use about a teaspoon and see what happens. Okay, that's about a teaspoon and a half. All right, that's all I'm gonna put on there. I'm gonna let them set for a few minutes to see if they firm up. I'm gonna get a couple photos. So one of the photos will be what you guys saw at the beginning of the video. And then I'm gonna cut one open and give it a taste. So I think it's time we give these a try. I put the glaze on, I let it set for a good half hour just to make sure it had firmed up. It has mostly firmed up, as you can see here in the picture or the video. See how the edges, it's a little solid in there, but it's still soft. So not a bad problem, but you could probably even add a little more powdered sugar than what I did, or cut back to a teaspoon and a half of milk and or water, whatever you're using, and then add a little bit more if needed. So I've got one of the uniced ones that I've cut open. You can see on the inside, looks like it has a good crust to it. Fruit in there, more than you would probably have in a Pop-Tart to begin with. Let's give it a taste. Let me break it again and see if we can get a better shot. There's another shot of that fruit in the middle. That is a really good gluten-free pastry. The crust is a little crisp, but it's tender, buttery. The jam, homemade. So if you have the stuff to make the homemade jam, or just want to make it because you want it all homemade and no store-bought, definitely make that jam. The texture is very similar to a Pop-Tart, I will say. It's more of a cookie kind of texture, but Pop-Tarts are kind of like that anyway because they're not really pastry. I really like these. I would definitely make these again. I would change up the flavors to make what I want. So let me go over a couple things with the recipe. To start with, easy ingredients to get. Everything was pretty much stuff I had on hand. The only thing I did not have was the strawberries that I bought this morning. Next, it has additional xanthan gum than what the Bob's Red Mill has. So I'm assuming that is for structure. So that worked out there. I did let the dough rest so everything could hydrate, and that allowed everything to be absorbed as well as that xanthan gum to work. So I would definitely do that even though the recipe doesn't state to. As far as rolling them out, I didn't really have any trouble with it. The dough broke up just a little bit, but it was far easier than other doughs I've worked with. Filling was easy to make. I just took out what I didn't want, the cinnamon, because I was making a strawberry filling, and I had to swap out the lemon juice for lime juice, but it still worked. It doesn't taste like lime juice, it tastes like strawberry. That worked out really, really well. As far as baking, they baked up well. They could have baked probably a few minutes less to not be quite as golden around the edges, but taste-wise, they taste fine. I'm okay with that. The glaze, not my favorite. I don't like glazed Pop Tarts to begin with, so that's a flavor profile on my part, not in the way this recipe worked. I would like the glaze to be a little firmer on the top though. As far as putting these in your toaster, I don't know if I would do that or not. I do think they're still a little more tender than dealing with a Pop Tart. What I do think is that you could put it in your toaster oven. I think you could reheat it in your oven or even your air fryer for just a few minutes to warm it through. I would try one of those methods before I tried the toaster itself. Finally, storing these Pop Tarts. The recipe, and I keep looking over because my magazine's lying over there. You can keep them for up to 3 days is what the instructions say, but they will freeze for up to 2 months. I think freezing is a great option. They're not going to take very long to thaw out at all. Plus, I think it'll keep that crust a little bit better. Guys, what do you think of these gluten-free Pop Tarts or toaster strudels, whatever you want to call them, toaster pastries? I think it's a great recipe. I think it's worth trying. Leave me any comments below with what you think of this recipe. I definitely think it's worth trying with those other gluten-free flour blends with the xanthan if you have other brands. Guys, I want to thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.